Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. I'm kind of excited here this morning to have Christine Baes from the University of Guelph on. So she's a professor and acting dean of external relations, chair for research in the Canadian Livestock Genomics. So welcome to the podcast, Christine.
Thanks, Keith.
Just to kind of kick off, if you want to maybe talk to the listeners a little bit about your background and kind of how you've got to where you are today.
Sure thing. Well, I grew up milking cows and picking stones in Perth County. My dad and brothers ran a dairy farm there. I did my bachelor's degree in Guelph, but I did some exchanges in, I shouldn't even admit that today, but in Russia and in Germany. Then I found out in Germany, the beer was a lot better than it was in Canada. So I went and did my master's in animal welfare there. Continued on to do a PhD in quantitative genetics in Germany. Worked on a horse breeding stud farm for a while. Then I moved to Switzerland and worked for a pig breeding company, and then kind of the Swiss version of Lactanet, dairy genetic evaluation organization. I taught when I was in Switzerland in Zurich and Bern, and then I moved back to Canada in 2015 to take up at the time, it was called the CMEX Holstein Canada CDN professorship in dairy cattle genetics that kind of evolved into a Canada research chair in livestock genomics. And in the 10 years that I've been at Guelph, I've had the opportunity to teach courses and work with a lot of fantastic colleagues and spend more time with my family. So that's all good.
So with your work, like, are you primarily in dairy, or are you looking at all different livestocks, like when it comes down to the genetics behind things?
Yeah, so initially it was the position here at Guelph was mainly focused on dairy, but I did I don't know if you know Ben Wood. He used to work at Hybrid Turkeys. He walked into my office one day and said, hey, there's this opportunity in turkey breeding. Do you want to do a project together? That ended up to be a pretty fantastic experience. It was we got $6 million to play around with turkey genetics. It doesn't really matter anymore what livestock it is, but because the DNA is all the same, right? So yeah. I work primarily in dairy. That's kind of what my heart beats faster for. But the genetic selection part is the same regardless of which species you're working in. So we kind of love to spread the wealth a little bit.
So when you're looking at, I'm going to be very simple here, but so when you're looking at DNA, like a turkey, like, is it just different things are triggered to make a turkey or a cow? Like if you're looking like from a genetic big helicopter view.
Yeah, totally. So, and that's it's not a bad question at all. The genetics of organisms on this planet, it is all composed of DNA. And DNA basically is just 4 letters, 4 base pairs that it's made up of. And it doesn't matter if you're a cow or a cauliflower or an earthworm or a piece of grass, it's all the same DNA. What's different is the amount and the order of those letters in basically the blueprint of the organism. So humans, for example, I'm going to guess that you've got about 3 billion base pairs in your DNA. So 3 billion of these A, C, T's, and G's in your DNA. That makes you Keith.
Yeah.
I've got about, I probably have a few less than you because you're probably smarter than me, but
I doubt it.
That's a human genome, right? And a cow genome has just a little bit less. So oddly enough, around 2.7 billion base pairs. And if you look at 2 cows and you were to take their DNA and flatten it out and compare it, it would be almost identical. But the differences between the DNA, between 2 animals, make them individual. And we were really surprised the first time we saw this, because, you know, the difference between cows and humans is we're about 80% the same.
Really?
That explains a lot about a lot of people, but you know,
Yeah.
it's really surprising, right? And if you think about COVID, for example, the virus of COVID is also similar. It's only about 30,000 letters, but it's an RNA virus, so it's a little different, but it's the same principle, right? So it's a lot shorter. If you take a mouse or a chicken, it's the same DNA, it's just shorter. It's just a little bit in a different order. Does that answer your question?
So yeah, but like, why does it, like, what makes it, I guess, more complex versus less complex? Like, is it like if a piece of grass and we have the same DNA structures, there's just less in the chain combinations? Like, what's the cost of that?
The cause of that is the genes, I guess. And
Yeah.
it's not even, I wouldn't even say it's always less complicated. Like
Yeah.
trees, for example, they've got incredibly complex DNA structures. Humans have about 20,000 genes in our DNA. So those are the parts of the DNA that actually code for protein. They'll do something.
Yeah.
Cauliflower has 100,000 genes. So technically cauliflower is more complex than humans. So it's not a question of complexity. It's just a question of what order that DNA is in and how it translates into protein coding regions that then allow the different organs to come together and do the things that they do, to allow movement, to allow thought. And that's really the mystery of life. And we haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah. It's like, when you start talking about this and you've got billions of DNA, like, where do you even start? Like, that's the hardest part, is getting started, right? Like,
Totally. And we're in such an exciting time right now because I remember sitting in Switzerland the first time I had a bull's DNA sequence on my screen. It was such a really a special moment because it's a pretty intimate thing when you think about it, to
yeah,
look at the DNA of a living organism, right? I never asked that. I can't even remember his name, right?
yeah,
But I never asked him if I could look at his DNA. But at the same time, the technological process that we've gone through really allows us today to have the DNA. You know, right now, LactaNet here in Canada has tens of thousands of Canadian cows in their database. They don't have the full sequence, but they've got, you know, quite a bit of genotypic data on all of the registered DHI cows in Canada. And you just start by trying to basically attach that DNA to a milk record. And
mhm,
any animal that has a high milk record, you can start to kind of see the patterns in the DNA that are associated with that high milk record, or better disease resistance, or improved efficiency, right? And then that's kind of where you start, right? You're looking for patterns in the DNA that are associated with the things that we want to breed for.
yeah. So, like, is this all started? Like, is it a computer model? Like, everything goes into that, and then it does the matching for you, or are you looking at
We
lines and
write the
lines and
computer
lines?
program.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We're looking, yeah. So we create the programs that will run through and match up the DNA. And it's less of a program and more kind of a statistical model, or a bunch of math models that we've used and that have been developed over the years, not just here at Guelph, but of course that's the holy grail of genetic selection, right? So
Yeah.
there's groups in the States and in Australia and in Europe who are all kind of doing the same thing. And whoever's fastest wins the race.
So you guys are writing the algorithms for it, and then we
Yeah, we're
DHI.
working on it. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. So like Flavio Schenkel here at the Center for Genetic Improvement of Livestock, he's a methodology guy. Dan Tulpin is a bioinformatics guy. Angela Canovis, she uses a lot of the new omics technologies. That's super cutting edge stuff. And together, we work with industry partners like LactaNet, people like Filippo Miglior, Janusz Jamrzik, all the guys and girls who are working at Lactanet and CMEX. We work together to kind of think up, collect information, and then develop ways to select the best animals for Canada.
How is artificial intelligence influencing this now? Or is it you're kind of in the beginning stages?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's useful, but it's like everything, right? If you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out.
Mhm.
So we've used AI in the context of analyzing dairy comp records, oddly enough. So the beauty of dairy comp is that it's really flexible, right? And that's also its biggest drawback. So a couple of years ago, we wanted to know what the effect was of timed AI, so synchronization programs on breeding for fertility, because we thought, okay, if we can't differentiate or if we can't figure out which animals are on a timed AI program and which ones are just being bred with their natural fertility, maybe our evaluations for fertility are biased because everybody who
I never,
is
I never even thought about that.
getting hormones,
Yep.
everybody who's on a timed AI program, they're going to look really good, right? They may
Yep.
have can I swear? They may have, I don't know, they may have the
Yeah, you
worst,
can.
I was going to
Go
say the
ahead.
shittiest, but it might, okay. they might have, they might have the shittiest fertility of everybody, but because they're on a timed AI program, they look really good.
It masks it.
If that, it masks it. So if that goes into a genetic evaluation, those animals are always going to come out looking really good, but actually not having really good fertility, which is not good, right? So we did some analyses and ultimately we ended up figuring out, yeah, it's true. We should be writing down which cows are on a timed AI sync program and which ones are not. Now, I'm not saying synchronization is good or bad. I'm just saying we have to write it down and account for it, or else we're going to be breeding cows that perform really well when they're on a timed AI program, which is not necessarily what we want. Now, AI is what you originally asked about because
The other
of
AI.
dairy comp, the other AI, the other AI, because you can use because you can come up with your own codes in dairy comp, right? Like there's no
Yep.
drop down menu that says I used an OVSync program or I used, a double OVSync program. People are writing it down however they want. So we actually had to use AI to go through all the dairy comp records in Canada and figure out what some of these codes meant. So when you get a code where somebody writes down "Dad said so," it's kind of hard to attribute that to a double OVSync program, right? So
Yep.
I mean, our PhD students at the time, they went through thousands of different codes, um, and you can't do that by hand. So we were using AI to differentiate what we thought were timed AI programs compared to just, a breeding program. So anytime, for example, a farm had all of their breeding dates on a Tuesday or on a Thursday,
You
that's
could
pretty
kind of
clear.
you could kind of pull out that. Yeah.
Exactly. But I mean, it was, it's, it's coming more and more. There's more and more opportunity to use it, but you still have to have a brain, right? AI
Hmm.
is not going to solve all the world's problems without having a really well-defined approach.
Well, you still have to tell it what to do, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, like you have
Absolutely.
to set the parameters on like the barriers on it and say I want to look at this and this
Yep.
and anywhere in between and then kind of let it go. Like I've been using a little bit. I'm pretty slow on the uptake on some of these things. But looking at like Chat GPT and Grok and things like that and kind of playing around with it and it it's truly it really is amazing. I didn't know how, I guess in academia, how it would be implemented in things like this, especially when you're pouring over millions and billions of data sets, right?
Totally. I mean, one of my students created a podcast. I can't even remember I think it was like Google LM or something. They created an entire they uploaded a scientific publication, and then they created a podcast where two people who sound like real people are discussing the results of this scientific paper. And it sounds real. I mean, they may completely misinterpret everything that's written, but it sounds real. which is kind of freaky at the same time, right? Because it might be total bullshit, but it sounds like it's a legitimate thing.
You might
So
be
you got to be
sitting there and
careful.
go, what did they just say? That isn't
Yeah, or
right.
first year, I taught first year biology last semester, and I was talking about form and function of a cow, and I asked ChatGPT to create a picture that depicts form and function of a cow, of a dairy cow. And what it came up with was this crazy picture that looked really like a cow that was, part of it was open and you could see inside of like the intestines and the anatomy, but it was completely wrong. And the label, like it said that the forehead was an udder, and it said that it had like 7 teats. It was just totally, it looked real enough, but when you look a little closer,
Mhm.
you're like, man, that ain't right, man. So there's a long way to go yet, but it's pretty exciting stuff. It's pretty cool.
With the resilient dairy project that you're working on, like I guess like a very high up in the funnel look at it, like what makes a cow resilient versus not? Like I guess from a production animal standpoint, like what we see out in the industry, like you could have a cow that has a blood ketone level of 2.0, and that cow is just rocking along and doing fine. And you could have a cow that's got a blood ketone level of 1.0 and she's crashing. Like what is the difference?
Yeah, it's a pretty complex thing. Generally, you'd say an animal that can stay fertile, still produce milk, not get sick while using less feed and producing less greenhouse gases, and is able to adapt well to a different climate, or like if it's getting a little warmer, a little colder, that she doesn't get sick in that would be a fantastically resilient cow, right? The overall picture. It's
Mhm.
kind of like we talked earlier about Moneyball. It's
Yep.
kind of like the movie Moneyball, right? You're trying to find the absolute best mix of traits that's going to make you money. And you want to pick those cows to be on your team. And basically, you've got a bunch of different dials to turn. You've got management, you've got nutritional aspects, but you've also got the genomics of and genetics of the animals. So, in a nutshell, all breeding programs are aimed to improve the genetic material that is being passed on to the next generation. With our Resilient Dairy Genome Project, we've honed in specifically on 3 different areas. Number one, closer to biology, fertility. Number two, enhanced disease resistance. Number three, feed efficiency and methane emissions. And the reason we did that is because the government was giving out money for sustainability, and we wrapped in fertility and health because we thought it was important. Don't get me wrong. I mean, dairy cows in Canada are responsible for about 1.2% of our greenhouse gas emissions.
Mhm.
I don't want to tell you how much money we've already spent on research around methane emissions and feed efficiency, because it's a lot. The good thing is that, using our brains, we can actually incorporate some other aspects of dairy cattle selection, which are really important to Canadian farmers, including fertility and disease resistance, and which also have a really big impact on animal resilience, because we want strong, healthy, well-producing, economically sound cows.
It's really mind-boggling when you sit down and you get looking at it. And it's really interesting doing the podcast because I get to talk to people like you and people in other fields that are like experts in doing the research on it. Like how much actually goes into the decisions like that the producer's making on the farm, like the amount of work that's gone on to get information so a producer can make an informed decision on the management of their farm. Like it's truly mind-blowing on all the information behind it, right? So,
Totally. And you know what? I'm so proud and so happy to say that almost all of the research that my team and I and the group here at Guelph that we're doing is feeding not just like we're scientists, right? I'm a professor. I'm supposed to be writing scientific papers and presenting at scientific conferences and all this jazz. But that doesn't really matter that much unless it's being used by farmers and unless
Hmm.
it's helping the cows too. So really, we have a list in the Resilient Dairy Genome Project, for example, we have a list of like 15 different traits, right? Some of them have to do with fertility, some of them have to do with resistance, right? Calf
Hmm.
diarrhea, calf respiratory disease, whatever. And some of them have to do with methane efficiency and methane reduction. Sorry, with feed efficiency and methane reduction. Now, it's crazy because I don't know of any other scientific area where the research results are picked up and brought to the finish line by industry partners so quickly as in the area of genetics here and this ecosystem that we have here in Guelph. And I don't
Yeah.
want to boast, but seriously, it's pretty amazing. Canada is the first country in the entire world to have a methane efficiency national breeding evaluation. That's huge. And I know a lot of farmers are like, that's stupid. We don't need that. But really, it shouldn't even matter because we've got about $180 million a year of genetic exports. So semen, embryos, all this kind of thing. We're one of
Yeah.
the only countries in the world that still has a co-op technically, right? Like CMEX is a co-op that's
Yep.
that's competing at the world level, which is pretty freaking awesome, I think. Right? Like
Hmm.
all these traits are being moved into reality and moved into use. This fall, Lactanet is going to try and develop or try and deliver on uh, diarrhea, calf diarrhea, and calf respiratory disease. So genetic evaluations for calf health traits. That's
Like,
amazing.
is this calf going to be more prone to getting a disease or not? Like through a
Less
genetic
prone.
eval, less prone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, they're lowly heritable traits, but over time, if we keep breeding and if we keep our management up, right? If we keep looking after our calves, which is of course the be all and end all of calf management, but also we're going to have a tool that's going to help us select for the most healthy calves,
That's amazing.
which is awesome. It's cool.
Yeah. And even at a low heritability, like it's still probably one of the most, like morbidity would be one of the biggest, I guess, cost drains on the dairy industry. Like you do all this work to get a calf and then, you get diarrhea, you get pneumonia, you get things like that. Like we still are dealing with babies, right?
If
And they're
we
very,
told if we told the beef guys how many calves we lose in the first 2 months, they would be shocked. Like I've seen literature values of up to 15% either through stillbirth or death in the first 2 months.
yeah.
Like that's insane.
I,
That's insane. We can do
I
way
think,
better than that.
I think it was, they did a study at University of Minnesota on how many animals born on a dairy don't make it through their first lactation. And the number was like 60 or 5% or something like that. Like it blew my mind. If we could get this figured out and say do a 10% improvement and say 55% of them make it through their first lactation, like the amount of dollars that translates into the industry would be mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, you want that, right? I sent a bunch of students to go visit Frank Luigi on his farm, and he was showing us a cow that it was 16 years old, and the students were like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even think they could live that long." Of course, they can live that long. I don't know if you want them to, but
You go to you go to a beef herd and they've got cows that have had 12, 15 calves.
totally, totally, and
Like
then you
why
can get
can't we
into
do
a
this in dairy?
well, you can get into a fight with the vets about the economic value of that, but that's another
Yeah.
story, right?
Yeah.
Any vet who does economic values, you got to kind of take with a little bit of, I better watch out. I'm getting a little spicy here, but you got to kind of watch out, when a vet starts doing economics, you just got to be a little careful with that. And everybody should be doing economics, right? Everybody should be
Yeah.
considering what's the biggest bang for your buck, but in a way that is sustainable,
Hmm.
right? Like, I don't think that I've seen some papers and some literature reviews and stuff, but I don't know what is a good longevity, right? Cows that are old, cows that are not old. Um, is replacing them with the next generation really that much better? somewhere there's an optimum, and I guess that's going to be different on a per cow basis, right? Some cows might be really efficient and great to keep around, and others are not, and that's what we've got to kind of work towards in order to get this optimal herd and resiliency, but also sustainability. And I don't mean sustainability in like the cheesy, stupid meaning of the word. I mean it
Yeah.
literally with the three, standing on three legs, right? Economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and societal sustainability, because we're under a pretty big magnifying glass. People are looking at what we're doing and they're either agreeing with it and buying our product or not.
Well, it's quite a social contract, right? That
Absolutely.
that producers and consumers have, right? They expect the
Absolutely.
producer to do a good job and take care of their animals, and they'll buy their product. And I think that like the longevity thing is a bit of a conundrum because yeah, you want to keep animals around longer, but you got all these new fancy genetics coming in that are more efficient than say a sixth or seventh lactation cow. Like if like
Absolutely.
from our point of view, or when I'm looking at a herd, like once a cow's probably got to her sixth lactation, that's probably seems like it should be their last, because if you look at the milk production, sure, that cow is paid for herself and is very profitable. But if she's going to produce the same amount as a 2 year old, why would you keep, and the 2 year old has better genetics and more potential to have a better second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth lactation. Why would you keep the old cow around?
Exactly.
But
Exactly. I mean, back to Moneyball, right? Like
yeah,
that's why some athletes just get kind of traded off and fade off into the distance a little bit.
yeah.
But
I
where
want to
that is probably a pretty individual thing.
Yeah, and I think not all farms are created equal. Like there's a lot of similarity between farms, but some farms are better at certain things than other farms. So I guess you got to
Absolutely.
kind of take that information in and work with the producer to kind of make the best fit for them. I wanted to circle back a little bit on the methane and the feed efficiency. So feed efficiency is something that I've been very interested in because I think that dairy is probably behind on what poultry and swine have done on some of these numbers, and it's something that's getting talked about more, but probably not enough. But the price of everything just keeps going up. So if we can make more with less, I think at the end of the day, that's a that's a good combination for the producers. But like, how heritable is something like feed efficiency when you're looking at a genetic evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, feed efficiency, the way that Canada does it is probably has a heritability, I'm gonna guess around 14%, something like that. And it's interesting because it's a trait that we've fought long and hard to get, but it's really, really complex, right? It's a lot of other countries use RFI, or residual feed intake. That's just the difference between what you would expect an animal to eat and what it does actually eat.
Hmm.
That seems like a simple way to do things, but and a cow that eats less than expected without losing body condition or decreasing production is technically more efficient. But we use that idea and we account for differences in, when we do account for differences in feed consumption, we can see that there are differences between production level, body weight, things like that. So we have to get down to the true metabolic efficiency. In Canada, we've got a new trait. It's relatively new. I think it came out a few years ago as the result of, again, an example of this research going straight into the industry, takes into consideration dry matter intake, but also metabolic body weight and energy corrected milk. So you've got the energy input being taken into consideration and also the energy output. And that is feed efficiency, the way that Lactanet has defined it. The good thing is that this trait is genetically independent of everything else that's in the current index. And why that's a good thing is because you don't want to start screwing up metabolic disease, for example, if
Hmm.
you breed for feed efficiency. You don't want to touch that. You want to make sure that these metabolic disease traits are still, that an animal is still healthy, but in a specific part, and it's not in the transition period.
Yeah.
After the transition period, you want to make sure that you're selecting for animals that are utilizing all of the feed that they're taking in. So right now, Canada, yeah, we're at the forefront of selection for feed efficiency, and the savings is pretty considerable that a farmer can achieve.
Yeah, it's funny like looking at some herds, like there's feed efficiencies, some herds typically run, 1.4, and we've got herds that are closer to 2, and it's like what is the difference here? It's funny, like you could put the same diet roughly in front of different cows in different barns, and just their genetics or their management or how the feed's processed and looked after, and it's like you can get two very, very different results.
It's the secret sauce, right? It's
Yeah.
why are some farmers doing well and others aren't? I hate to say this, but a little bit of self-criticism is probably a healthy thing here, right? If you're not pushing your feed up, if you're not checking your silage, if you're not talking to your nutritionist about what you're feeding, and if you're not looking at your feed efficiency evaluations that you can get, you're probably not at the head of the pack, right? Like there's a
Mhm.
bunch of things that you have to do in order to win this game and to make more money. And if you're not doing them, you're probably not winning.
Well, it's like we'll make another baseball analogy, but you could, because it's spring training started, but uh, you could have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have the work ethic to express that, like it just doesn't happen naturally. And you see it with professional
Exactly.
athletes and things like that, where, you know, one thing coming off, like everybody, we were talking about the Four Nations Cup here with friends and stuff over the weekend, and Sidney Crosby's the best player in the world. It's not because he's the most talented, like he is super talented, but he's the hardest working guy out there. He was the oldest person in the tournament, and everybody that was playing with him looked up to him growing up, and to be there and look at what he does off the ice, like that's all that those athletes were talking about. Like they were just so amazed by it. And I think we can look at some of that stuff with dairy, not even like with the producers, is that there are producers that are out there doing extra feed pushes or installing Junos and doing all these little things that are kind of separating them from, Joe Farmer down the road that's not implementing some of these things. So
I know I'd look a hell of a lot better if I used the treadmill that was in my basement too. Like I spent money on that, and if I don't use it,
me
it's
too.
not gonna help me out, right? Like you have to actually do it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, all of the investment in the kettlebells or whatever the hell it is that you've got in your own personal gym, it's not gonna help you out.
So with the some of the research you're doing on the sustainability side of things, like I know we had talked in the past there about like the methane number and the feed efficiency number. Like, are they tied together at all? Like, if a cow has less methane, they ought to like they're inherently more feed efficient.
Yeah, this is a good story. No. If you would have asked me that 3 years ago, I would have said, hell yeah. And
Yeah.
that's what we were trying to use as, a great argument because it makes a great argument. We know that methane expulsion from dairy cows it could represent a loss of energy. And we thought that the more feed efficient cows would have lower methane emissions. But the most recent work that we've done doesn't show that. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. It just means that we're going to need both in our index, which is what Lactanet has decided to do. They're incorporating very soon both feed efficiency and methane efficiency into the LPI, or the Lifetime Performance Index, because they're not necessarily as connected as we thought they were.
Mhm.
But the pattern for methane efficiency is exactly the same as for feed efficiency. We've got the energy sinks and the energy input that we have to consider. It's genetically independent as much as we can make it from all other traits. It's a standalone trait and it needs to be selected for. Now the question is, what's that all worth? And a lot of farmers see, methane efficiency as not really one of their main goals. But I tell you, if there's a carbon credit system that's going to come down the road, and that all depends on politics and a whole bunch of other things, but if it comes, we're ready for it. And secondly, it's a really good story that doesn't cost a lot, right?
Hmm.
Like we can actually be part of the we can do good things for the climate, even if it's tiny, right? The goal, Dairy Farmers of Canada, they've committed to this net zero goal by 2050, and you got to have numbers backing that up. So I think that through genetic selection, and right now we're actually working with nutritionists to combine nutrition and genetics together, we can. So why wouldn't we do that? It makes a really good story. And I
And
think it's good for the industry, and it doesn't detriment anything really.
how much does feedstuffs have on, like, how much of an effect is there on methane production? Like, I know we're talking about genetics, but like, is a high forage diet, say, less methane produced off that compared to, say, a higher concentrate diet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on the forages and on the concentrates. So surprisingly, the heritability of methane is at about 24%. So the heritability of methane is even higher than feed efficiency.
Is that like
That
on a
means
heritability
that,
scale, is that pretty heritable? Like one out
yeah,
of like so I
totally.
guess to oversimplify this, like one out of four times you breed that animal, that offspring will have directly that trait tied to her.
Let me give a different example.
Yeah.
Milk production has got a heritability of like zero point 0.3, maybe 0.32, something like that. At
Percent?
0.24, which is the heritability for yeah, percent.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little more complicated because you'd say the percentage of genetic variance that's explained by the additive genetic. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
There's a theory behind heritability, but basically what it's telling you is that that percentage of difference that you see in animals is caused by genetics, basically.
Yeah.
So if you have a heritability of 25%, let's say for easy math, 75% of what that animal is producing in terms of methane is coming from either the environment, its feed, or other non-genetic factors, right?
Mhm.
So that's a big chunk. But if we've got feed additives, for example, okay, they sound fantastic. You read a lot about them in the news, but they're freaking expensive, right? Like they're really, really expensive. If you want to start feeding seaweed to cows, oh, it's not going to be an easy thing. So we need like a multi-pronged approach. You need to think about genetics, you need to think about feed additives, you need to think about forages, and then you need to combine all of those things together. I think we have a new project that we're working on now. We're actually aiming for a 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050 through a combination of genetics and nutrition. That's basically the numbers, right? And it's totally doable, and it's totally measurable too. It's not
Mhm.
like we're greenwashing or saying, we're just going to come up with some weird number and say that we can achieve that. The goal is actually we're measuring on commercial farms where we've got a bunch of sniffers installed, they're called, and we're measuring methane emissions. We're looking at feed that's going in. We're trying to figure out what is the optimal forage concentrate ratio, level, combination, whatever,
And I guess
to
type
make
of
sure
forage
that we
too.
can achieve that.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
would guess
totally.
type of forage
Totally.
too. Like, does corn silage, say, emit less or more methane than, a high, like a haylage or a grass, right? Like, I guess there's a lot of
It's so
questions
true.
that
It's
be
so
asked
true.
in that kind of realm.
And the whole microbiome, right? Like there's little bugs. There's more DNA in the bugs in a cow's gut than there is in the cow itself, which is crazy. And some people will say, "Oh, but it's not the cow that's producing the methane, it's the bugs in the gut that are producing the methane." I would argue that the cow itself, the cow's DNA is going to dictate what bugs can live in its gut. So ultimately it comes back to the
Yeah.
host genetics again anyway, right? And that's what we're seeing, but it's still good to fight about it. Everything.
Well, the more I learn about cows, the less I know about them, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Like
Absolutely.
they're such a complex creature. There's so many different variables that go into making milk. It amazes me, to be honest. So, was there anything else that I guess you wanted to touch on with some of the work you're doing at Guelph?
Well, I think there's one really important factor, and that is that there's a big group of researchers here at Guelph that are working in dairy, and sometimes it seems like we might be pretty far away from the guys out there milking cows, but really we're on the same team. I think
Hmm.
that's kind of the most important thing, and we do understand that at the end of the day it's the bottom line, and we're trying to use this we're trying to think up good research and make sure that it's relevant. And even if some people say this methane stuff is stupid or whatever, I'm telling you, we're on the same team, right?
Hmm.
We're trying to make a resilient industry for future generations. And in order to do that, we've got to kind of work together. And we've been really impressed with the amount and the number of farmers that are willing to work with us. They're installing sniffers, they're letting our students come out to their farms and collect data. And it wouldn't be possible, I think, in another country. And I think we're really lucky to be here in Canada with the producers that we've got. Generally, it's been really positive. And I think, overall, if we can make a more resilient cow that is still fertile and that does still produce a lot of milk and can make the producers money, then we're winning the game, basically.
What you guys are doing at Guelph, like it really opened my eyes when I was there in August because I hadn't been to the new research facility there, but it is state of the art. Like, and the amount of things that projects that are going through there is quite astounding, actually. And it's good to have it in our backyard, and it's
We're
good
super
that
lucky.
yeah, and it's really good to have producers willing to work with the university. I think I don't know, 4 or 5 different farms that work with some kind of project almost every year, if not every other year, with the University of Guelph. And half the time, I don't even know. It's just one of they've got a group of students coming in and doing this, and a group of students coming in and doing that, and people doing their masters, on commercial farm studies here and things like that. So we're pretty fortunate, I guess, here in Ontario to have that.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's sometimes you get kind of caught up in the politics of it all, but ultimately, ARIO, OMAFA, the dairy industry itself, they all really had to come together to make that happen. I'm seeing it now with the poultry industry, that it's not easy to get everybody on board when you're building and planning a facility like that. But
Hmm.
man, are we ever lucky to have that willingness, and people who are willing to maybe have a fight every now and then about what should be done, but at least that they care about it, right? You
Yeah,
got to
and I
build
would
something that you're proud of in a couple of years and not
Yeah, and I would encourage listeners to go see the facility at University of Guelph, like the dairy facility, because it is pretty impressive. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are tours available, whether it be for groups or for, yeah, we're open for business. It's a great thing to have. And as long as we keep it up, we're ahead of the pack, and we can still take this position as Canada's dairy university. It's the
mhm.
research is done right here.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast this morning, Christine. I know it's been a while. We talked about it a while ago, and we finally made it happen. And I really do appreciate you taking your time out of your day to talk about some of the projects that you guys have going on because like I mentioned earlier, like we have a social contract with consumers to do the best job possible and be cognizant of environmental impact of that as well. And I think you guys are kind of on the leading edge of making that happen, both from a consumer and a producer side. So I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's an honor. It's an honor to have that kind of a connection with the producers and with you and your team there. So anytime.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.